So today I thought it would be interesting to talk about the Federalist Papers, which are a document that is relatively well known to people even outside of the political science sphere. They're a document that's talked about a lot in U.S. history classes in middle school and high school. It's a document people are familiar with, and it is a document that people are likely to have their own opinions on. The focus of the Federalist Papers tends to be, or the focus of the analysis of it tends to be on things like the Supreme Court, Congress, the powers of the president, and things like that. But I think that all these things, while important, are red herrings as to what is the real big topic that is at the heart of the Federalist Papers, and it has a lot to say about liberal democracy and the problems that it faces as well. But before I can discuss how the Federalist Papers contribute to this discussion, I have to backtrack a little bit and go at it from an angle, because the Federalist Papers don't deal with this explicitly. They implicitly deal with this problem in the first 10 of the Federalist Papers, but they don't do so explicitly, so I'll have to illustrate sideways, essentially. So I want you to imagine there's one society here, or it doesn't have to be a society, just a group of people in a particular area of land, and here next to them you have a second, smaller group of people. And these two societies, their decision making is done democratically, because we're talking about democracy here. And this group of people, it's important to realize that these two groups are sort of separated. Think of them as two states, right? They're next to each other, but they're not overlapping necessarily. And this group, the larger group, they want X. They want something. They want X to happen. And this other group the smaller group wants Y to happen. Why this is important is, look at what happens when we change the way the scope of the democratic discussion. If elections are held within this circle, so that both X and Y are in this electoral zone, X will obviously win and Y will be forced to adopt X. But if, on the other hand, you give both societies, or both groups, their own democracy, which they can decide things internally in, X will get to do X, or the bigger group will get to do X, and the smaller group will get to do Y. The reason that this is important is because it kind of undermines the notion of liberal democracy altogether, and I want to explain why. We all understand that democracy is when the will of the majority. If you get a majority of the votes, you get your way. But this understanding doesn't really talk about the majority of what. What is the totality that there's a majority and a minority of? You might look at what I've done here, what I've drawn here, and you might say, okay, well, if Y is regionally distinct, then it'd probably be right to give them their own democracy, right? It'd be good to have them be separate. They can decide things their way. The problem with this is, what if there's a regional minority within Y? Do they get to break off? What if there's a regional minority within this regional minority? Doesn't this logic, won't it get you to the point where every person is essentially on their own? So this isn't to say that we need this, we only need one world government, and that there's no logic behind creating regional districts. But the thing that I'm trying to illustrate here is that the scope of democracy, the borders within which you do it, are completely arbitrary. And despite being completely arbitrary, they have a huge impact. Depending on how you draw it, why the smaller group will either be forced to adopt X or not, or it'll be able to do its own thing. And another problem that's funny is, what if Y isn't regionally separate, and instead they're dispersed around inside of the larger group? Now, I think most people would say, well, if you have an internal democracy within here, they're going to lose. But they just won here. So is it the case that in this society here, gay people can't marry, but if all the gay people cluster up in one area, then they can marry? Right? This question of boundaries and jurisdiction of democracy poses a big problem. And like I was trying to get at, and I've said, the problem is that it's completely arbitrary. And to illustrate this arbitrariness, let's take a look at gerrymandering. What's wrong about gerrymandering? Why is an electoral district that is a square any better than an electoral district that is like this? You might say, well, look, gerrymandering is manipulative, it's usually done with ill intent. I say, okay, what if it's not done with ill intent? What if it's either not done with intent at all, like it's just random, or it's done with good intent, or anything? And can't that be done with ill intent too? Is there something inherently better about the square than about this mess on the right? As long as you maintain the rule of one person, one vote, then, just from a democracy perspective, the way you draw districts shouldn't be a problem. Let me look at my notes here. Right, okay. What I wanted to get at next is that this whole jurisdiction nonsense gets to another problem within democracy. And it's this idea that we don't want minorities to be oppressed, but it seems like necessarily in democracy, if we define it as the majority winning, there will always be some minority that gets screwed over. And like I said, the creation of majorities and minorities is largely a product of the way you draw electoral boundaries, but those are arbitrary. So there's this kind of dialogue that happens between conservatives who are really proud of, America and democracy and stuff like that, and they talk about our democratic history, and then snarky liberals come in and they point out that, who wasn't present in the democracy? Native Americans, ethnic minorities, stuff like that. And they point that out as a stain on liberal democracy, on a stain on American democracy. The problem with this is that you can totally let minorities vote and they still lose, right? The liberal might say, oh, who couldn't vote? The Native Americans. Okay, then let's bring them in to vote. We're having an election about whether or not this piece of land here, like what's going to be done with it. And you got 40,000 colonists and 5,000 Native Americans that are involved, that are in the region. And you say, okay, liberal, you want there to be equal voting rights, let there be equal voting rights, and we'll see who wins the election. Obviously, the colonists. And in this case, it seems to me at least that the liberal would have to just accept this. Internally everybody got a vote, Um, there was no kind of cheating shenanigans. All 5,000 of the Native Americans got to vote. There was no restriction on voting with voter ID or anything. You can have all the social rights protections you want, and still the colonists would have won. So I hope it's evident how this ties to the notion of jurisdictions. Because again, if you said, no, 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 this piece of land here that we're talking about, the colonists don't have a right to vote on it because it's foreign. Okay, that would solve this immediate issue. But it would lead to the question of why can't literally anybody subtract themselves from a democracy when they don't like the way the election turned out? If Alabama loses an election, can't Alabama also, draw a line and be like, sorry, bud, whatever you voted for doesn't apply here? And again, so we, I'm gonna simplify this. In liberal democracy, you necessarily need some lines. When you draw lines, you create minorities and majorities. But we seemingly don't want minorities to get screwed over. But we still want the majority to win. How the hell does that fit together? Well, the problem is it doesn't. And this is one of the biggest problems of liberal democracy. Of the theory of liberal democracy. And it's a problem that the Federalist Papers discuss. And they fail to answer the question. They essentially shove it aside. I think in one of them, well, I know in one of them, I just don't know which one it is. I know in one of them, they straight up admit that there's not a solution to this. That this is, it's whoever's best guess as to how stuff should be partitioned. And we need to ask ourselves, what is the consequences of this? Well, I'm going to try to answer that, so that question was, kind of pointless. But I do want you to ask yourself this, because maybe the answer I give won't cover everything. Touching on I want to tie this back home a little bit to the Federalist Papers. The first 10 Federalist Papers, if you haven't read them, they essentially discuss if the United States should remain united, or if all the states should be independent, or if there should be some, 3 smaller United States out of a couple of states each. So necessarily, it's talking about jurisdiction. It's talking about what I was talking about right now. And the way the writers of the Federalist Papers solve this, quote-unquote, solve this problem, is they essentially tell everyone to shut up, that there is a national interest, that there's a common good of the United States, and that all the individual states and all the people within the states should follow this general good and be kind of subservient to it. So, instead of having multiple, jurisdictions, they argue for one totality. This totality we understand to be the nation state. Traditionally, the United States is not really considered a nation state, but at the time of the writing of the Federalist Papers, it was. In the Federalist Papers themselves, they talk about how we all have the same background, we all have the same language, we all have the same religion, we all have the same culture, etc. So at the time, it was considered a nation state. And I think in this discussion we're having right now, it doesn't actually matter if it's multinational state or just a nation state. This totality is understood to be the nation state, and the Federalist Papers argue essentially in favor of this totality that is the nation state. So, tying back to what I was talking about earlier, this is necessarily the producing of majorities and minorities, and kind of consuming smaller regional interests into what is the general interest. Or at least that's how they present it. But the question you need to ask yourself is, how general is the general interest? When they say we or us, you need to ask yourself, who do you mean by we or us? If Tennessee has an interest to go to war with somebody, and New York has an interest for peace, why shouldn't Tennessee go to war and New York be at peace? And isn't saying that the general interest is for there to be peace, aren't you just hiding New York's interest behind what is the general interest? Right? So you need to ask yourself, is this gesturing towards a national interest just hiding individual interests behind this totality here? How much is this, for example, masking class conflict? If 90% of people would benefit from the redistribution of Jeff Bezos' wealth, for example, how is this not a general interest? Right? 90% of people would benefit from this. But no, people would say, no, it's in our general interest for Jeff Bezos to keep his wealth. Well, how much are you, in this situation, how much are you hiding Jeff Bezos' interest behind the general interest? Who decides what the general interest is? So, I hoped to have illustrated how the way that we draw borders in democratic jurisdictions can manipulate the outcomes of elections and whose interest gets expressed. And there's one more thing that stems from this, and it's this notion that the nation state is an entity that has a sense of self-preservation. Democratically, from a point of view of democracy, if I live on the border with Mexico and I own my land and I disagree with the politics of the United States, why can't I subtract myself and my land from the United States and join Mexico? From a point of view of democracy, there's nothing wrong with this. But I can imagine there'd be massive resistance to this idea, both from ordinary people and from government officials. And the question that needs to be asked is why? In the Federalist Papers, they justify the unity of the United States as a military thing, as, America needs to be united and strong to defend itself. First off, that has nothing to do with democracy. Liberal democracy generally doesn't like to present itself as this militaristic ideology that puts, like state safety and our ability to colonize and stuff like that above democratic principles. And we saw, just as well as the writers of the Federalist Papers saw, that the 13 colonies beat the British while they weren't particularly united. So this all goes to, ask the question, why is the nation state so adamant about keeping itself together? Is there any inherent good in it keeping together from, a point of view of democracy or any principles or any theory? And what I want to leave this off at is kind of an aside, but not really. We're a lot more similar to the Soviet Union and China than we would like to admit. All three of us are revolutionary states. And all three revolutionary states face the same problem. And that is that after the initial revolutionary generation, it seems that there is a massive resistance to any kind of further revolutions. So, the people who wrote the Federalist Papers, Madison, um, Jay, these Hamilton, I think, these guys, they're from the revolutionary generation. They're from a revolution that was born from resistance to taxes, to top-down governance, and things like that. And just a couple decades later, or not even a couple decades, a decade later, they're writing about how we need a strong central government to put down insurrections, and how Shays' rebellion is unacceptable, and how we need to restructure the whole Constitution because of it. This, to me, is odd, and it ties in with what I was saying about the nation-state trying to preserve itself. It seems to me that all these revolutionary movements are all gung-ho about revolutionary ideals until they take control of the nation-state. And the second this nation-state is involved, they become the most ardent conservatives. They flip on the spot. And, which, I don't want to put my thoughts into your head, but I think this is kind of worrying. Or, it's generally not productive. And while I talked about a range of topics, I think they're all connected, because this notion of a nation state that wants to keep itself together and that it has its own interests apart from the people constituting it, that comes from drawing circles or squares or lines, from drawing legislative boundaries within which we contain democracy. And while liberal democracy has pretty solid principles as to how democracy should be done internally, it says absolutely nothing about these boundaries, about the borders of democracy, about the limits of democracy. It says nothing about that. And that's what I think can lead to oppression. It can lead to conflict. And probably most importantly, it can lead to the suppression of civil liberties in the pursuit of some kind of general good, as if this circle is somehow inherently valuable, as opposed to this circle, or this triangle, or this square. That this circle is somehow something worth fighting for, and if you want to leave, you can, but you can't take your land. If you want to create a sub-circle, no, you cannot. You have to respect the election outcome within this bigger circle. So in a way, I think there's something very authoritarian about the way liberal democracy is framed. Which, if I'm right, I made a series of claims in this video. If I'm right, it should give everybody pause, and everybody should reflect on how they think this should be solved. Because I think if it is as big of a problem as I make it out to be, this is a problem that ought to be solved, and it would challenge the notion that we're at the end of history. That, we figured everything out, liberal democracy is the final ideology, and we're just ironing out kinks. If what I said is true, that's not the case. Liberal democracy has a massive hole in it. It's got a hole in its theory, and this hole causes problems. But that is as long as I'm right, which I might not be. So, I'm always a supporter of people making their own opinions on things. If you have watched this long, then I appreciate it, and I'm sure you have made your own opinion on this subject. And I hope that you think about it, that you try to come up with a solution to this problem. And I once again thank you for watching through this video.